Hey, 8th grade. So today we're going to start talking about the scientific method again. And let's start off by just going through the steps of the scientific method. Step 1 is to make an observation about the world around you. Next, you create a testable question, which we talked about just the other day. The third step is to formulate a hypothesis. And for this, we use if, then, and because. Then you test your hypothesis by experimenting, analyze the data you collect, draw conclusions from that data, and then you can accept or reject your hypothesis based on those conclusions. So, for example, if my observation is my tomato plant soil is always dry by the afternoon and I water them every morning, my testable question might be, do my tomato plants need to be watered twice a day? I may then hypothesize that if I water my tomato plants twice a day, then they will grow taller because their soil is drying out too fast. To test my hypothesis, I'm going to water one group of my plants twice a day and the other group of plants once a day and take measurements every day for a month. This way I have repeated experiment. And then I would then repeat the experiment in order to make it valid because it needs to be replicable and should be repeated. The next step I need to do is analyze my data. After I analyze data, I can then draw conclusions. The tomato plants that received water twice a day grew taller on average, and from that I can accept or reject my hypothesis. When we talk about testable questions, we're talking about asking questions about objects, organisms, and events, and they're answered through investigations that involve experiments, surveys, or more observations. They're also answered by collecting and analyzing evidence. Non-testable questions cannot be verified with an experiment and can be based off an opinion. An example would be, who makes the best coffee in New Orleans? Testable questions should be written in the format, how does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? So, there's 3 different types of variables we're going to talk about. The independent, the dependent, and the control variables. The independent variable is the only known variable in an experiment, and it's what's being manipulated or changed. When you graph it, this goes on the x-axis. The dependent variable is the unknown variable, and it's being measured by the experiment when data is being collected. When you graph this, it's on your y-axis. Control variables are unchanged factors that stay the same throughout an experiment. They're not influenced by the independent variable, and they're used to compare results to. Just a quick reminder about the hypothesis. This is an educated guess about an event and is testable. We use if, then, because when we create these hypotheses. Once we have all of our data collected, we can make conclusions and use our analyzed data to make a statement about the experiment. All experiments must be replicable and should be repeated in the procedure in order to be considered valid. So anytime that you write out a procedure, you should have a repetition or instructions to repeat the procedure. The last piece of information I'm going to give you before you move on to your worksheet for today is the difference between a data table and a graph. This is something that we've struggled with historically this year, and a data table is just that. It's a table that's set up with numbers. It's a little hard to read. Well, a graph is usually a visual representation of a data table. So when it asks for a data table, you should be making these little boxes and you should have a grid-like area. And when it's a graph, it should be drawn either a line, a bar, or a pie, depending on what type of graph it's asking for. Go ahead and move on to the questions to answer. Once you're done, you may be on Quizlet or finish your worksheet?